when I told my friend John O'Callaghan, who's a professor at Notre Dame and a Thomist, that I was coming here to speak at the Angelicum for a TI talk, he said, "Do they know about you there?" I said, "Well, they're about to find out." So that'll make more sense once we go through the talk. But I've had this. I am a one-trick pony, and my one trick is largely defending medieval Muslim authors against Aquinas' criticisms. Not entirely. I think Aquinas lands some punches for sure, but that's the one trick. And really, fortunately, when I was working on the Averroes book, I was a visiting fellow at Notre Dame. And I was part of a Aquinas reading group, and Father Philip Neri was in that group, and we were reading De Unitate Intellectus against the Averroes by Aquinas, and it was just so helpful for me to think through this book on Averroes by hanging out with Thomas and hearing all the objections. And so hopefully that same sort of thing can happen today as I'm working on Avicenna. Okay, so Avicenna. Let's see. When are we supposed to end, Father?
Go for 45 minutes.
Okay.
And that'll give us 15 minutes for questions.
Yeah, great. So Avicenna or Ibn Sina, as you may know, has a kind of emanationist epistemology. So he thinks there's, unlike Aquinas, he thinks there is an agent intellect, but it's a separate eternal substance. And it somehow is responsible for moving our potential intellects into being actual intellects. And for sure, it's also responsible in Avicenna's system. It's called the giver of forms, so it emanates forms into the material world, and that's what is responsible for substantial generation in the world. And then the traditional view of Avicenna, and certainly the one that Aquinas had of Avicenna, is that the agent intellect also emanates intelligible forms to human minds when those human minds are properly prepared, properly disposed for receiving the intelligible form from the active intellect or agent intellect. And the traditional view says that happens with any acquisition of an intelligible. So the first acquisition of intelligibles, that's how it happens. But also famously, whenever I recollect some intelligible that I've known or that I know, but haven't been currently contemplating, the agent intellect is responsible for emanating that form to my mind again. Okay, so it's an emanationist epistemology. So as I said, the traditional view says that emanation happens in every case of intelligibles coming into a human mind. But I've argued in a 2020 article called Avicenna's Emanated Abstraction, and I'm going to develop this view in my book. I think there's a way, there's actually competing textual evidence in Avicenna, and it's become a big debate amongst Avicenna scholars about whether there is just an emanation that's responsible for the first acquisition of intelligibles, or whether actually Avicenna thinks you acquire intelligibles in the first case through some kind of abstraction, so more like Aquinas' story. And there's textual evidence for both those views. So I try to reconcile that textual evidence, in part because there are several key passages where what Avicenna says is that the active intellect emanates not an intelligible form, but actually a power. And I think the power is the power of abstraction. So we get this power and all other powers from the agent intellect on Avicenna's view, and that's what enables us to abstract the form from the beginning. And so I think that understanding of Avicenna, or the abstractionist understanding of Avicenna, actually kind of mitigates a lot of Aquinas' criticisms of Avicenna's view of intellect. Many of his criticisms are based on this emanationist view, and he thinks that's just not Aristotelian. He doesn't take abstraction seriously. So I think a lot of those criticisms are mitigated if I'm right about Avicenna. And in fact, Avicenna and Aquinas agree on a lot more than Aquinas thought they did. Okay, so if you have questions about that and some of the texts that I'm going to talk about, if you read those texts, you'll see there's kind of criticisms of that view in the neighborhood. So I can talk about that more in Q&A if you're interested. But there still remains this thorny and very interesting issue of the habitual intellect, or we might call it habitual knowledge or intellectual memory. And I mentioned it just a minute ago. What do we say about the intelligibles that I've already learned, but I'm not currently contemplating? For sure, and everybody in the Avicenna debate, the abstractionists, the emanationists, everybody agrees that Avicenna is totally clear that the only way I can recall a previously known intelligible is if the agent intellect emanates it to my mind. Okay, so everyone's agreed about that. But as we'll see, Aquinas does not like that view. Okay? So just to make sure the view is clear, it helps to introduce the notion of first actuality and second actuality here. Okay, so the Aristotelian terms, most of you probably know it by heart. Maybe Father Philip Neri is going to tell me now that Thomas actually think there's like 15 different kinds of first actuality. so we'll see. Avicenna thinks about, he calls first actuality, it's a kind of potentiality still, but it's very close to actuality. Okay. And now maybe Philip Neri is going to tell me, there's actually like 15 types of first actuality that Thomas distinguished, and the 15th type is the closest to actuality. It's the kind of first actuality that just had coffee with second actuality, so it's like really, really close. I don't know, but for most of our purposes here, we can just distinguish between first and second actuality. Second actuality is when I'm thinking of that intelligible. Right now, I'm currently thinking of it. Okay? First actuality, I know it in some way, but I'm not currently thinking about it. Okay? The example I give my students is LeBron James. When he's on the basketball court, he's utilizing that power to play basketball right now. When he's at home on the couch, he's not using it, right? But still, it makes sense to say that he's actually a basketball player. Much more so than I am, right? Even though I've got some remote potentiality for playing basketball, like I've got 2 arms and like I'm sort of tall, but I actually can't really play basketball. Like LeBron James is actually a basketball player, though he's not currently using that ability when he's sitting on his couch at home, okay? First and second actuality. Now, Aquinas' view about this knowledge in first actuality, second potentiality, I think is pretty intuitive to many of us, I suspect. I think it's very intuitive to think, well, the things that I know that I'm not currently thinking of, they're still mine, like LeBron's power to play basketball, right? They're kind of in me, and I can like pull them out whenever I want to, right? So think about the ancient image that we get from Plato's Theaetetus of the aviary. It's got all the birds flying around in there, and we think of our mind as like the bird cage, and then you can pull out the concept that you want at will. But I'm going to show you Avicenna's arguments and then Aquinas' arguments against Avicenna's view to try to put some pressure on Aquinas. And here I'm not just going to argue that Aquinas got Avicenna wrong, which is my normal hobby horse, but I'm going to actually try to suggest that maybe Aquinas got something wrong, although I think there's potentially a view available to him that will preserve the things that he wants and will allow him to kind of keep the really important metaphysical principles that he shares with Avicenna. Okay, so there's the setup. So in the Psychology of the Healing, which is one of Avicenna's most important kind of philosophical encyclopedias, Avicenna gives us 5 options for thinking about these intelligibles in first actuality. So, and those are on your handout. So, first option is maybe the intelligibles are stored, in first actuality, in the body or some bodily organ. Second possibility, maybe the intelligibles are stored in first actuality in the material or possible intellect. Avicenna normally calls it material intellect. Aquinas calls it possible intellect, so material possible. Somewhere in here I may abbreviate that as MPI, and the agent intellect or active intellect as AI, so just to familiarize you with the terms. So 2 is Aquinas' view, right? The third option, intelligibles always exist in second or complete actuality in the material possible intellect. Fourth option, maybe the intelligibles are self-subsistent in second actuality, just of themselves. So those would be like Platonic forms, right? The intelligibles just exist of themselves always in second actuality, out there. Fifth view, and this is Avicenna's view, is that the intelligibles always exist in second actuality in the separate agent or active intellect, which re-emanates those intelligibles to the soul whenever we seek them out and understand in second actuality. Okay, and roughly Avicenna's argument is not 1, 2, 3, or 4, so therefore 5. This is not as clean of an argument as some of Avicenna's arguments, but I think this is actually a pretty typical kind of disjunctive setup from him. And so I'm tempted to think that this actually is a pretty exhaustive list of the options. So you think about the difference between 1 and the rest of them is either it's in the body or it's not in the body. Okay, so then if it's not in the body, well, then either it's in the soul or it's not in the soul. So in the soul would be covered by 2 and 3 in the 2 different kinds of actuality, first actuality or second actuality. And then if it's not in the soul, then either the intelligibles just exist self-subsistently, or the only other option for separate intelligibles is that they exist in some intellect, some separate intellect. If it's not our intellect that's in the soul, then it's in some separate intellect. So I think it's a pretty exhaustive disjunction. So Avicenna says not 1 through 4, therefore 5. Okay, I think his denial of 3 and 4 are pretty self-explanatory. We're not always thinking of all the things that we know. That seems pretty straightforward. Avicenna, like Aquinas, has Aristotelian arguments against separate Platonic forms. Okay, so if you're interested in that, we can talk about it, but I'm going to leave those aside. So why not 1, a corporeal storehouse? Well, here's a text from Avicenna. He says, "We said that the soul's body and what is attached to its body is not fitting for this, since it's not fitting that the body should be a place for the intelligibles, nor is it fitting for the intellectual forms to have position, and their conjunction with the body would make them have a position. So therefore, that's why it doesn't work, right? So this is old hat for anyone who came to the last talk, right? You know that intelligibles can't be in a material body, they're immaterial things, right? So this seems pretty straightforward. It may seem obvious, but I think it reminds us of a very important metaphysical constraint on our theories here. So place, in general, like an aviary or a storehouse, is at best a metaphor when it comes to intelligibles, right? So intellects are not places, right? They're not physical storehouses or aviaries or anything like that. They're not places. I think that's important. It's also important from an Aristotelian perspective because, as Avicenna argues and Aquinas elaborates at some length, the power of memory is supposed to operate through a physical organ, a part of the brain, according to Avicenna, right? So on this kind of Aristotelian inheritance that they both have, Aristotle thinks of memory as a function that has a bodily organ, okay? And actually, Aquinas admits this. He says, look, this is an important Aristotelian consideration. It looks like memory is a bodily kind of storehouse. And that makes it look like kind of straightforward that there couldn't be any Aristotelian intellectual memory because intellect is not compatible with having a bodily organ. Okay, so there's at least his rejection of one gets us part of the way towards Avicenna's view. So the real question, why not two? Because two is Aquinas' view, that the intelligibles are just stored in first actuality in our intellects. Here's text 2. This is part of Avicenna's argument against 2. It's impossible for us to say that this intelligible form is existent in the soul in complete actuality, and that it does not understand it in complete actuality, since the meaning of "it understands it" is nothing but the form is existent in it. Okay? Here's how Aquinas himself puts Avicenna's view in text 3. Avicenna says that intelligible species remain in the possible intellect only when they are actually understood. Second actuality, right? He proceeds to prove that because when apprehended forms remain in apprehensive powers, they are apprehended in act. For sensation comes to be in act because it is identical with the sensed thing in act. And similarly, intellect in act is the understood thing in act. So I think actually Aquinas' formulation there is right. If you look at that part in the Summa Contra Gentiles, it's a pretty faithful rendering of Avicenna's arguments. And I think that's a good way to put it. What is the argument here? Well, for an intelligible to be in an intellect is automatically for that intelligible to be in act. You can't have an intelligible merely in first actuality in an intellect. Why? It's in part because of something called the identity thesis. And this comes from Aristotle and a bunch of other people in between Aristotle and Avicenna and Aquinas. The view is that the intellect and the intelligible are identical. Okay? The way Aristotle sometimes puts it as with things without matter, right? Intellect and intelligible, the form is identical to the thing that receives the form. So intellect and intelligible are identical. You can see this in De Anima 3.4. You can see it in Metaphysics Lambda in several places. Very important thesis for Aristotelian metaphysics, I would say, about intellect. So in things without matter, so intellect and intelligible, they're identical. So I kind of think of this as there's nowhere for the intelligible to hide, right? If you know this old Motown song by Martha and the Vandellas, nowhere to run to, baby. Okay, so this is Martha and the Vandellas principle. There's nowhere for the intelligible to hide. When an intelligible has no matter, is in an intellect, and remember that's at best a metaphor, they're identical. So there can't be any hiding of an intelligible. It can't like go behind a wall so that I'm not thinking about it, right? It can't get under the covers or something so that I can't see it. The intellect is identical with it. So if my intellect is in act and it has an intelligible, then that intelligible better be in act, namely second actuality. Okay, Aquinas admits that this thesis has a lot going for it, but he raises multiple objections to it across his corpus. Now let's look at some of these objections. First of all, Aquinas says that this view is against Aristotle, and we might also say it seems like it's kind of against common sense, Avicenna's view. So text 4, Aquinas says, but this opinion is clearly incompatible with what Aristotle says. For he says in De Anima 3, De Anima 3.4, that when the possible intellect thus becomes each thing as one knowing, it is said to be an act, and that this happens when it is able to operate from itself. Thus, even then, it is somehow in potentiality, nevertheless, not in the same way as before learning or discovering. Okay, so I think there are several important bits to this, and he's mainly just relying on Aristotle's text here. So there's this idea that the possible intellect becomes something and is then identified as a knower of that intelligible. And it's said to be an act in some way. But, well, what kind of an act? Well, it's able to operate from itself, just like LeBron is able to get up whenever he wants and start playing basketball. It's able to operate from itself. And Aristotle, sure enough, says it's not in the same way as before learning and discovering. So when I know some intelligible form, but I'm not currently thinking about it, whatever that form is, form of triangle or Pythagorean theorem or whatever, when I'm not currently thinking about it, it has a kind of actuality because my mind has become it in the past. And I'm able to think about that whenever I want, right? Sure enough, it's in potentiality in a way because I'm not currently thinking about it, but it's not the same kind of potentiality as before I ever learned the thing. So that's some important constraints. I think the most important emphases here are, first, that the intellect is able to operate of or from itself in this state, habitual intellect. It has a habitus, right? And second, there's this affirmation, this clear affirmation of first actuality, an actuality between pure potentiality and second actualities, affirmation of first actuality. Let me give you, and I think this is a similar case. Sometimes Aquinas cites Physics 8:4, and I think is making largely the same points with that Aristotelian text. I'm going to come back to text 4, but let me move to the second argument from Aristotle, which is in text 5. It's also clear that this opinion is contrary to the opinion of Aristotle, who says in De Anima 3:4 that the possible intellect is the place of species, which is to say nothing other than a storehouse of intelligible species, as in the words used by Avicenna. Okay? Aquinas is right. Aristotle calls the intellect the place of forms, topon edon. And sure enough, earlier in 5.6 of the Psychology of the Healing, Avicenna does himself use the image of a storehouse. Okay, he says when you pull this concept out of memory, it's like pulling it out of a storehouse. Okay, so Avicenna does use that metaphor. I would say the problem with Aquinas' objection here, though, is that Aristotle says this description, the soul or the intellect as a place of forms, is okay only because the forms are in it, quote, not actually, but only potentially. Okay? And the context, Aristotle there is talking about how the possible intellect is nothing before it thinks. So I think the context strongly suggests first potentiality there. If it's the place of forms, and Aristotle is talking about how it's nothing before it actually thinks, when he says it's the place of forms, but only potentially, I think he means first potentiality, not first actuality. Okay, but think back to text 4 and our constraints. There's an affirmation of first actuality, and there's this ability to do it whenever I want. Now look at text 6 from Avicenna. Avicenna says, it happens that when the soul returns to not actively contemplating, this form comes to be in potentiality, but a potentiality very close to actuality. First learning is like treatment for the eye. For when the eye becomes healthy, then whenever it wants, it reflects upon the thing from which it takes some form. And whenever it turns away from that thing, then it comes to be in potentiality close to actuality. When it is said that so-and-so is one who knows the intelligibles, its meaning is that whenever he wants, he procures its form in his own mind. And the meaning of this is that it belongs to him to conjoin with the separate active intellect whenever he wants, with a conjunction in which he will conceptualize that intelligible form from it. Not that this intelligible is procured in his mind and brought to conceptualization in his intellect always in second actuality, nor Now, here I want to make a correction. I was kind of translating along, and the way I translated it was, nor that this intelligible is like it was before learning, but I think a possible translation and a better one in this case would actually be, nor that his intellect is like it was before learning and obtaining this type of intellect and actuality. So the last part of the sentence is, and some things I'll say about this passage makes me think maybe the better subject there, the understood subject, is the intellect. The intellect is not like it was before learning and obtaining this type of intellect and actuality. It's the power of obtaining for the soul understanding of what it wants. And whenever it wants, it conjoins with the AI and the intelligible form is emanated into it. This form is really the acquired intellect, and this power is the intellect in actuality in us, insofar as it belongs to us to understand. Okay, that's a nice kind of statement of Avicenna's view. Option number 5 at the top of your handout, this is kind of a nice statement of what he thinks it entails. But notice that it emphatically affirms the 2 main points that Aquinas' text 4 did. He affirms unequivocally that we have this ability to do it whenever we want, at will, right? Whenever we want, we pull out the intelligible that we want. And he also affirms first actuality, right? It's this actuality that's close. It's still potentiality, but it's close to actuality, second actuality, right? So he affirms first actuality. But first actuality in text 6 applies to what? I think the last part of the passage suggests that it's our intellect that is in first actuality with respect to various forms. And that's what he calls the intellect in actuality. So that's a technical term. That's like a technical term for Avicenna. The intellect in actuality is an intellect in first actuality. It has some intelligible form, but it's not currently thinking of it. But he says the form, the intelligible form itself, is the acquired intellect. Okay, so that's also a technical term in Avicenna. And what Avicenna means by the acquired intellect is the intellect that is contemplating, actively contemplating an intelligible in second actuality. Okay, so notice the claim here. The form is the acquired intelligible. The form is the acquired intellect. You might think, this is a weird thing. How is the form the intellect? Oh, remember the identity thesis. Intellect and intelligible are identical. Okay, so he can say the form is the intellect, the acquired intellect, that's just the form in second actuality. Okay, I'm making a big deal about this because I think Avicenna can affirm a kind of real first actuality with respect to us and our knowledge. I think he would say, yes, we have knowledge in first actuality in the sense that our intellects are in first actuality with respect to certain forms. And we can pull those forms out whenever we want to use them, right? But there's a metaphysical point that he's trying to make, which is that the form can't be stored in merely first actuality in the intellect. The only place it could be stored is somewhere where it could be in second actuality, which is namely in this separate eternal intellect that's always thinking all the forms. Okay, so it is stored in the separate intellect, and it comes to be in us later when we're ready to conjoin with it. But he's affirming, I think, all the common sense things Aquinas wants to affirm. We do it when we want to, and there is a sense in which we are in first actuality. We have this kind of habitual knowledge or habitual intellect. I think this is also true of the Aristotle passages that Aquinas is talking about in text 4. So I think the actual passage from Aristotle talks about the intellect being in a kind of actuality, which is nevertheless still potential, but not in full actuality and not like the potential before learning. So I think the Aristotle passage in De Anima 3:4, the subject is the intellect in first actuality, but not the intelligibles. Aristotle doesn't say the intelligibles are in first actuality. Okay, so that means the intelligibles don't. The intelligibles do not, or at least need not, enjoy a status of first actuality in the human intellect. we can perform the relevant activity at will without having the intelligible forms stored in our intellects. Okay, so much for the kind of Aristotelian objections, or objections from Aristotle's text. Aquinas goes on to give some other objections from reason. He says, I'm not going to give you all of these, but I'm going to focus on two. So the first one I call a fantastic objection. Sorry. Okay, here it is, text 7. This is from the Summa Contra Gentiles. Aquinas says, we see that our soul is more disposed to receive things from separate substances the more removed it is from bodies and sensible things. For by receding from what is lower, it reaches what is higher. Therefore, it's not accurate that the soul is disposed to receive the influence of separate substances by looking to corporeal phantasms. Okay, and that's the view of Avicenna, or at least that's the view of Avicenna that as he's reporting it. So Avicenna says, there are texts in the neighborhood of 5-6 that I don't quote here, where Avicenna talks about kind of looking at the images and focusing on the images, and that sort of prepares us to receive the intelligible form. And there's debate, again, about whether this is the first acquisition of an intelligible or the recollection of a previously grasped intelligible, but those are the passages that Aquinas has in mind here. So the idea is that by being prepared, by looking at the images in the right kind of way, I receive this emanation from the separate intellect. And Aquinas says this is no good. This doesn't jive with reason, because we see actually that you have to sort of separate yourself more and more from material things in order to receive things from these separate substances. Aquinas calls this an innovation, a novum from Avicenna. This is a term of disparagement in medieval philosophy. You don't want to be an innovator in medieval philosophy. It's not like Elon Musk or something. Okay, so Aquinas actually seems to drop this objection. If you read like the Summa Theologiae arguments against Avicenna, this one isn't in there. Why? I think it's because probably even in the early Summa Contra Gentiles text, Aquinas himself affirms a very thoroughgoing Aristotelian requirement that you can't have any understanding without a phantasm. So I think Aquinas' own view doesn't jive very well with the objection in text 7. And in fact, Avicenna is more in line with the principle behind text 7 than Aquinas himself is. Avicenna actually does think that as you separate more and more from material things, your intellect gets stronger and stronger, such that at least at some points, he implies at the very least that it's possible that human beings can know things without relying on images. He's got this great analogy of, he says the images and the sense faculties are like a riding animal. It's like a donkey. You take it to where you want to go, and then you leave them behind, right? It's like your Uber. You get in the Uber, you get to where you want to go, and then you send the Uber driver away. He doesn't like come in your house and watch TV with you. It'll just be awkward, right? So the images, the phantasms, they're a help at first. You need them at the beginning, but Avicenna thinks, kind of more Platonic view, you get away from them enough, and then you can kind of attach directly to these separate intellects without the aid of images. That's not Aquinas' view. Aquinas thinks you always need images. Okay, so I think Aquinas would not do so well against this fantastic objection himself. And we see his commitment to this in text 8. Aquinas says, therefore, the human possible intellect needs phantasms not only for acquiring intelligible species, but also for examining them in a certain way in the phantasms. This is what is said in De Anima 3, therefore the intellect understands species in the phantasms. Okay, so thoroughgoing commitment. Okay, another objection Aquinas gives, this is a kind of interesting one, and maybe you guys can help me understand it better. It's about the stability of intellectual forms. So you're unstable. Avicenna, you're unstable. Okay, here's how he puts it in the Summa Theologiae. It's text 9. What is received in something is received in it according to the mode of the receiver. But intellect is of a more stable and immovable nature than corporeal matter. If, therefore, corporeal matter holds the forms which it receives, not only when it acts in act or in actuality through them, but also after it ceases to act through them, even more does intellect receive intelligible species immovably and without fail, whether they're received from sensible things or even if they're emanated from some superior intellect. Okay, so the objection seems clear enough that if matter is able to receive some forms and retain those forms in merely first actuality, right, without acting through them in second actuality, and the intellect is sort of more stable and more unchanging than matter, it's an a fortiori argument. Well, intellect should be able to hold intelligibles in first actuality too. If matter can do this, so can intellect. Anything matter can do, intellect can do better, right? I'm not exactly sure what Aquinas has in mind. So in many cases, when you think about the forms that are received into matter, it looks like the resulting composite is going to express those forms only in second actuality. That's right. If the matter receives the form of red, it's just going to be actually red. If it receives a certain quantity, it's going to remain that quantity, but in second actuality, not merely first actuality. But maybe the color thing is something that he has in mind, because as we heard about in the last talk, there's got a lot of color and vision cognition going on in this conference, even though we're talking about intellect. Colors are not actually made visible unless there's light, right, on Aristotle's view and all these guys' view. So maybe Aquinas here has in mind something like colors without light. So the objects retain their colors, but they're not actually visible if you turn out all the lights, right? So actually colored, but they're not expressing their visibility. Now, Avicenna disagrees with Aquinas on color and vision, and probably Aristotle also. Avicenna actually takes this passage that we heard from De Anima 3:5, where Aristotle himself says that the sun, the light of the sun, makes merely potential colors to be actual colors, right? And Avicenna thinks, well, light actually, what you have, an object in a dark room is actually not colored in itself. And by turning on the light actually actualizes the potential colors in the thing and makes them to be actual colors. Okay, so this is a slightly different view than the thing is colored even in the dark room, but it's not yet visible. Okay, so Aquinas and Avicenna disagree about this theory of light and color, because Avicenna thinks you don't even get actually colored things without light. So if that's the way the objection's going, I'm not sure the two are going to see eye to eye. But even on Aquinas' view, we might ask, are the colors as potentially visible? Are they potentially visible in first or second potentiality? It seems like merely first potentiality. Colors are no more disposed to being made visible by light than any material thing is in itself disposed to being made intelligible by the active intellect. Okay, so if I turn off the lights in the room and I turn the lights back on, when I turn off the lights, it doesn't seem like this colored thing is like any more apt to being made visible the first time I turn out the lights or the second time I turn out the lights. It just seems like it's the same thing. It's an on and off switch. It's going from mere first potentiality in terms of visibility to second actuality. When I turn on the lights, it's actually visible. And I think I'm going to skip. I have a quote from Avicenna where this analogy is, of course, used by Aristotle himself in De Anima 3:5. The aged intellect is compared to the light of the sun. And Avicenna says exactly this. the agent intellect makes potential intelligibles to be actual intelligibles, just as the light of the sun makes potential colors to be actual colors. And he affirms the identity thesis in that text, but I'm going to skip it. So I'm not really sure if the idea of colors is what he's getting at, and they're kind of the fact that they're potentially visible without light, but then they become actually visible. So, and Father Philip Neri's shaking his head, so I know that can't be right. Okay, so now we know. I'm glad I'm here. Okay, saving me from lots of errors. Well, maybe Aquinas means something more like the disposition to play basketball or to play piano. Something like, something that involves muscle memory. We might think of that as a form that's retained in my body or my body parts that's not always actively being exercised. Now, there's a lot of debate about how to understand accidental forms in Aquinas, and I don't have a stake in those debates, and I'm not exactly sure what to say about these kinds of accidental forms. I think that kind of accidental form would be what Aristotle calls a having, or what gets translated into Latin as a habitus, right? So that seems to be the relevant kind of thing he has in mind. So what explains havings or habits like this that we or our bodies seem to have in first actuality? Well, we turn our bodily parts and our muscles towards other activities when we're not playing basketball or playing piano, and that's what explains why it kind of still has the ability to do those things at will, right? So it kind of retains that having, that habitus, even when it's not being exercised. But the sense in which I still have those forms is reducible to various other accidents. Just the fact that I continue to have the limbs that I have and that they continue to have muscle mass and so forth. But all those kinds of accidents are irrelevant, it seems to me, in the case of intellect and the intelligible. There's also the fact that I can do the relevant activity at will, but we've seen Avicenna kind of affirm that common sense view, right? So I can start playing piano at will, right? That explains the habit. But there's one other thing, and I think it's very important. In order to have habits like that, I think in most cases, you actually have to have some relevant knowledge, right? So if my 2-year-old goes up to the piano and happens to bang on some keys, and lo and behold, it sounds like the beginning of Jingle Bells. Dun, dun, dun. We wouldn't say that Joseph has the habit of playing piano, right? He's physically able to bang on the keys. He might even make a little song, make the sound of a song, but it wouldn't be, as Aristotle says, as the musical man does it, right? You have to have some relevant knowledge in order to have these kinds of habits that Aquinas might be talking about. So to be able to play piano or to be able to play basketball, there's an intellectual capacity in those kinds of habits. But if that's true, then the very examples at hand are parasitic on the case of habitual knowledge. So I think Aquinas' objection here would be begging the question, because if it boils down to having habitual knowledge, then the real question is, how do we have habitual knowledge? Is that because the forms are stored in first actuality or not? Okay, let me try to end really quickly with some lingering but very big important questions for Aquinas. And maybe we could even grant Aquinas this last objection. Whatever's going on in this last objection, let's grant it. Still, I want to ask, so you get stability, you get the intellect is able to retain these forms with a better kind of stability than matter or whatever, but at the cost of identity? So how is Aquinas going to continue to be able to affirm the identity thesis, which he does in text 3? How is he going to be able to affirm the identity thesis, but still say, well, there can't be a total identity because there's ability for the intellect to not be thinking that thing? right? You can have intellect and not have that intelligible. That seems like it violates identity. Another question. Does Aquinas' view end up accepting metaphysical self-causation? I think most Thomists don't like the idea of self-causation. But notice that in order for the possible intellect to bring itself into second actuality from merely first actuality, is to bring itself from a kind of potentiality into actuality. And as we heard in the last talk, Aquinas, just like Avicenna, thinks the reason why you need an agent intellect to begin with is because our possible intellects don't have that ability of themselves. And that's because the things out in the world aren't intelligible of themselves. They have to be made intelligible by something that's already intelligible in itself. And we see Aquinas affirm exactly this in text 10. He says it's necessary, therefore, if the possible intellect should be moved by intelligibles, that the intelligible be made by an intellect. And since it is impossible that what is in potentiality in some way should be made actual by itself, it's necessary to posit, in addition to the possible intellect, the agent intellect, which makes intelligibles an act that move the possible intellect. So if he's really going to affirm that very, solid Aristotelian principle that if something's in potentiality, it can't move itself into actuality unless there's something else that's actual that moves it. I don't think he should I think the way to understand these things about the intellect moving itself, that seems right at a kind of phenomenological level. We definitely experience that. I do the thing whenever I want. I think about it at will. But metaphysically, I worry that Aquinas is in some hot water if he thinks the possible intellect is able to move itself while it's in a state of potentiality. Granted, second potentiality, but move itself from potentiality into actuality without the help of the agent intellect. So my question is, why couldn't Aquinas have a kind of Avicennian view? He can keep all the parts that he likes. So it's going to be an immanent agent intellect, not a separate substance, but the good old agent intellect that's in our souls that we all know and love in Aquinas. It's going to be non-emanationist because Aquinas' agent intellect isn't full of the forms and emanates them to the possible intellect. It does it through abstraction. But what if we think about Aquinas' agent intellect as, just like Avicenna's intellect in some ways, as always providing intelligibility, but in a different way than in the case of acquisition, and in a different way than in the case of just abstracting. So when it comes to recalling previously known things, why shouldn't Aquinas say that the agent intellect provides this intelligibility in a different and easier way with respect to the specific kinds of intelligibility the material or possible intellect has previously had before? And in fact, if you look at text 8 and 10, it looks like Aquinas wants to say that the agent intellect is always necessary, not just for acquiring intelligibles in the first place, but also in the case of turning back to the phantasms when we're doing other kinds of intellectual activities. Why can't Aquinas just affirm that the agent intellect is involved in those cases also and is kind of providing intelligibility in those cases and is what moves the possible intellect from that state of second potentiality into second actuality? So that's a question for you. All right, thank you.